Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Kat Leo, and I'm the studio coordinator of painting, drawing, and printmaking here at Anderson Ranch Arts Center. Thank you for attending our summer lecture series. At this time, I'd like you to please turn off or silence your cell phones. Tonight, we will be hearing two 20-minute lectures from our visiting faculty, Mark Newport and Rema Ghuloum. Following the lectures, there will be a Q&A session with both of these two artists. Our first speaker tonight is Mark Newport. Mark Newport's work uses textiles, performance, print, and photography to reveal the vulnerability inherent in traditional Western ideals of masculinity. His work has been exhibited internationally as represented by the Simone de Sousa Gallery in Detroit, Form and Concept in Santa Fe, and the Greg Kucera Gallery in Seattle. His work has been recognized by awards from the Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation and the Creative Capital Foundation and the Kresge Foundation. He is the artist in residence and head of the fiber department at Cranbrook Academy of Art. Please welcome Mark Newport.
Stage moves. All right. I am not putting my phone up here for a call. I'm putting it up here so I have a timer, so I stay at 20 minutes, because otherwise I'm liable to talk the whole time. We don't want that. All right. Okay, didn't even touch the button. So thanks first of all to Liz for inviting me to come out here. I've never been to Anderson Ranch before, and I'm kind of overwhelmingly excited about all this. And then I want to thank Teddy for all the work he's been helping out with in the sculpture studio. I'm really looking forward to working with the students this week and talking art, all different art. What I'm going to do tonight with my presentation is trying to kind of do a variety show of different things I've done over the different bodies of work I've made. And I'm going to talk about those things through two basic lenses, and then there'll be some stories at the end about what happens when the basic lenses don't work. So I'm going to talk about the work in terms of materiality and then process. And at the end, we'll have the look what happens when the studio starts off and you don't quite realize what you're doing. So first I'll introduce the work. And just to give context, this picture is from an installation at Greg Kucera Gallery in 2020. And it includes 3 pieces, a men's number 3, which is the red one, a men's 2, which is the green one, and then Reclaim over here on the right, from a show that nobody went to because it was during the pandemic. We all had those shows, didn't we? So, introduce the different bodies of work that I'm going to talk about tonight. The first body of work and the most current body of work is work using mending techniques and commercial cloth as well as used garments. And this has been going on since about 2015. Some of those pieces were in Greg Kucera. The mending happens in areas, press the right button, laser pointer, thank you, Kevin. In these kinds of areas where I've cut holes in the fabric and then repaired them, so any damage done to the fabric is from me. And all these pieces circle around ideas around the body, about how we tend to the body, how we tend to cloth, and the parallels between body and cloth. Prior to that, from 2003 to 2015, I was knitting a series of life-size, wearable superhero costumes. Some of them were larger than life-size. Some of them, like the one on the right, the Batman, were recreations of existing superheroes from the comic books. And then others are made up, like the one on the left, which is called Argyle Man, because, of course, there are preppy superheroes. And we'll get into those a little bit later. Prior to that, from 1997 to 2006, was a series of work where I transformed comic book pages and covers into what I thought of as quilts and samplers, referring to very nerdy textile things, but also referring to pop culture. So this is a piece called Freedom Bed Cover Number 1. It's sewn together comic book pages with satin blanket ribbon and embroidery in places on there where the hero's in trouble, which is a lot of places because the heroes are always in trouble in comic books. And then 1995 to 97, I was doing a series of alterations of trading cards. So football cards, like the Lyle Alzado card on the right, and then there's actually lots of other kinds of trading cards that aren't sports trading cards. And we can talk about that outside of the lecture because some of them get a little weird, but one of them is art cards from New York. So Jeff Koons over on the left there. So these are the basic bodies of work I'm going to talk about, and I could have done this about ideas of gender specifically, because that's been sort of the main topic of the work, about the body, about pop culture and material culture. I'm going at it through process and materials because I kind of think the equation of making work that I follow is materials plus process plus whatever my ideas are, form this really interesting mix where they support each other and interchangeably challenge each other. And so it gives me different ways of thinking about how I can make work and different ways the work can be understood by different people, which I think is important. So let's go to materials. And back to the mending work. And this is amends number 3, which was in that installation shot from the beginning of the slide talk. And where materials are concerned with the mending work, I'm using sometimes cloth purchased off a bolt from the fabric store. Think Joann's or sometimes nicer fabric stores. And some of it is plain muslin, so I'm sewing into that and sort of just transforming it and building image like a painter might. But some of it has patterns of its own, like the plaid wool here. And picking on these kinds of patterns is interesting to me because they have different references to different groups of people. They have different references to different modes of production. Where this cloth is concerned, red plaid is one of the most basic, allow me to be textile nerd again, one of the most basic kind of woven cloths. It works on the warp and weft threads that make woven cloth, and that grid structure makes the pattern. It also then has this history not only of weaving and technique, tartans, those kinds of things, but it's been produced someplace economically by somebody to support themselves, and so there's different kinds of histories there that I can access. For me, the history that's most interesting is that plaid is one of the most ubiquitous fabrics in the world, and it's a fabric that all sorts of groups of people have claimed as their fabric of identity. So think about grunge musicians in the 90s. Everybody's wearing plaid, right? Think about a lot of my queer friends who wear plaid, and it's like, this is my emblem, this is the thing. So it can reference identity. Also think about my grandfather, who in the 70s and mid-80s would wear his plaid shirts to fancy Christmas dinners with hand-knit sweaters by my grandmother, who's here, made out of variegated yarn. The variegated yarn will be repeated later on, so pay attention there. But it's a fabric then that means something to everybody and doesn't mean anything in a way, and I think that's kind of an interesting place to be. So let's go to the next slide. Back to the mending. So if a plaid fabric can get me to talk for 2 minutes about plaid, then think about it if it's actually used in a garment and what that might mean. I think that taking cloth from an actual shirt, not one of mine, but from a thrift store, cutting it apart, allowing it to reference the body and all the things that happens between human body and a piece of cloth is kind of amazing, and it's there in the work whether I talk about it or not. That fabric has absorbed somebody's sweat and somebody's cologne and somebody's love and somebody's rage. And whether I know that history or not, when I then cut into it and start sewing into it, I'm activating that and releasing that. And I think that's a layer of material that everybody can access in different ways. Like I said, I'm cutting into the fabric in different places, stitching into it and around it to then build images related to thinking about those histories. Another thing about these thrift store shirts that's interesting to me is here's the sleeves from a couple of shirts that they go back to identity in a way. These kinds of shirts, these button-up Oxford shirts, were the shirts that my father would wear to go to work, that my grandfather would wear to go to church. They were fabrics or garments that they wore at fancy occasions because they were aspiring to be people of a certain kind of class, coming from class positions that they didn't have originally. They were factory people, they were farm people, and they wanted those to show respectability and to show prominence. And so thinking about that as something that I was taught was important is another kind of element that's interesting to me in these pieces. Back to the costumes, also about aspiration in a way, right? If you're going to be protecting people and you're going to be the superhero, you need an outfit. That was the logic I had when I started this series. And whether you were going to be Captain America or whether you're going to be Sweater Man, that looks sort of like Batman, the materiality of these does have a kind of logic. It's a very personal logic for me, but it's a logic that works in kind of tandem with the idea of the hero being a protector. This kind of red heart acrylic yarn was the yarn that my mother used to make sweaters for my brother and I when we were growing up in New England. So it was a protective gesture from her to us that I'm then trying to play on in this work. But like I said, the variegated yarn comes back. Red heart acrylic yarn is the grossest, most nasty plastic stuff on earth in a lot of ways. And it's so amazing because it comes in these crazy colors. And they make these variegated yarns that are supposed to be like natural sunsets or like the American flag, which when you knit it at the size of a 6-foot-tall man, it looks like patriotic vomit. And so that's kind of interesting that the material can do that for me. And then the comic book pages are actually things that I pored over as a child, learning to draw. There weren't a lot of art lessons in my life, but everybody knew I liked to draw, so I always got paper and pencils. But then what would I draw? So reading comic books, which I didn't have a lot of. I wasn't a collector nerd person. I was just somebody who had them occasionally. The comic book pages were a way of me looking at role models, way of looking at bodies, way of understanding how to draw, to transform them now through embroidery. We'll get into a little later on, but that's a slightly different sort of edge on that. And then the trading cards. Oh, did I want to be a football player? I really did, but I grew into a fiber person, and so I think about materials, and I realize that beads can reference kind of fancy dresses and other kinds of things. And then football players are at their most hyper-masculine in these outfits. And so I can use these materials to contradict each other and challenge ideas about what's going on in those images. And the beads can also be like this one on the right, like the shiny, sparkly atmosphere of the activity, like the gold leaf on a icon from the Middle Ages or something like that. So it switches up what's expected. All right. Keep into time. So let's go back to the mending and talk a little about process. When I talk about mending, I'm talking about something that almost nobody does anymore. We don't fix our socks or darn them anymore, right? Well, I do, but that's because I knit my socks. And so I did some research, first learned about it in grad school, and then did some research in 2015 while I was on sabbatical, and learned these colonial American and European ways of cutting holes in fabric and then reweaving the fabric within a base fabric. And it was a thing that young women were taught in colonial era America and Europe. Two different social classes of young women, well-to-do young women to learn to be able to build their dowry and their trousseau and have certain techniques for running a house, but also young women in orphanages so that they would learn a skill to actually make money at. So thinking about gender, also thinking about this kind of performance of learning this thing and showing skill. It's very much a craft-based way of learning, which is something that's near and dear to my heart, but also kind of performative because none of these twill patterns or plaids are actually what this linen is behind it. And this one, this is a faux way of making knitting. It's not actually knitting. So there's knitting and weaving. And yeah, I know I'm being a textile nerd and I'm probably the only one in the room. But I love that idea that two things are sort of married together that don't actually belong together. So coming back to my own mending, working with remnants of these Oxford shirts and putting them together, building the patterns, suturing some of them together with suture stitches. The mending leaves a scar in the fabric, the same way when you stitch a body, you leave a scar on the body. And so going back to that reference of how close our garments are to us and what they might know about us, is also then this parallel of we heal fabric and we heal bodies in similar ways at times. So my repairs become these kinds of scars, and repairing something when you're doing stitching is actually hurting it while you're fixing it at the same time. The needle goes through, it pierces it. Also the stitch, the literal thread pulls and sort of forms a kind of tension. And I'm interested in that kind of dynamic, that you feel that kind of awkwardness in the mending. It's also because I cut the hole and then I filled in the hole, I'm not necessarily saying I'm making penance for anything I've done or sort of thinking about it that way, but it becomes a series of decisions about then what's the energy or what happens in the fabric and the skin around that sort of relates to experience and physicality. Because we all know, like if you've got scars, maybe we don't all have scars. I start looking for one of my scars. That part of skin, when it's healed, feels different when you touch it, and it feels things differently. And so there's an interesting kind of dynamic there. Another one of the mending pieces, and some scars actually get dimensional. And so thinking about mixing in other kinds of yarn into there and how they might not be orderly and they might not be what we hope they are. And the stitching in the comic book pieces, again, gets kind of nerdy, but these stitches that are long and linear were used in floral embroidery a lot and made dimensional so that you had like 3-dimensional flowers and fancy fabrics. I love that I can make them look like muscle striations and cross-hatching and other kinds of things that relate to my experience in the world. And then the other stitches, the little point stitches called French knots that are in Catwoman and Batman over there. They're like the Ben-Day dots from Liechtenstein paintings and silkscreen prints. And they're also pixels, and yet they also make the heroes a little bit softer and a little bit more vibrant, even though something really aggressive and violent is happening. And so the contradictions in there, they make it this kind of merge together multiple bodies monster, which is also kind of part of what superheroes and comic books are all about. So let's see, and then with the costumes, we can go back to process and think about, why would somebody knit a sweater weight superhero costume? Well, practically speaking, knit stretches with you. So if you're a hero and you have to move fast, the fabric works. There's a practical way of thinking about that. I know that's absurd logic, but just roll with me. It's also, knitting is an incredibly slow way to make something. It's peaceful and calm. It's not about fighting and punching. And so is the superhero doing his or her work in the costume while they're knitting, and that's how they fight? I don't know, but I think it's an interesting question. That's Bobble Man over there on the left, and this is Flamer on the right. More variegated yarn. Okay, I should have preambled that a little bit. But so now we switch away from process to what happens when you get in the studio and you start making things. Well, you're knitting these hollow vessels that hang on the wall, that are costumes, that are wearable, that have buttons, and you say to yourself after a year, or maybe I say to myself, they're wearable. Somebody should do performance in these. Notice I said somebody, not me, because I didn't necessarily want to do performance. I think there's a really long history of really bad performance art. I didn't want to contribute to it, and I don't like to be in front of people. Wonder why I'm a teacher. So photographs. I could stage a photograph in my studio, and I could knit myself in the costume, and it could be called self-made, and it could raise these questions about how does the superhero work. Photos required a certain kind of organization that I didn't necessarily want to do, but digital prints, inkjet prints, using digital photos and then Photoshop allowed me to return the heroes back to the comic book origins and give them a more imaginative space, and then I could insert text like, he knew if he could just finish this, he could help. Anybody who's knit knows that whenever somebody asks you to stop and do something, you're just like, no, I need to finish this row. But that row never ends, so you're not going to help them. So the hero's not very helpful. And then I did finally actually do performance live and in person. Sweater Man would knit because Sweater Man's superpower is to be able to knit a force field and protect himself or people, who knows. So Sweater Man is knitting the force field. You can see the people are staying away because there's a force field. And after he's done, he gives out IOUs to the people that he may not have helped. And it says, I owe you one protective gesture, Sweater Man, and the date. And then he goes away. Not as funny, but also relevant. So I showed you a lot of small pieces and whole shirt pieces for the mending pieces. There became this time with the reclaim piece, the plaid one that was in that very first slide, and with the blue pieces where I started putting together parts of shirts to ideally make a yardage again and make fabric that could be used for something, which was an absurd idea about waste with the thrift store shirts. And what that did, because of the scale, was it turned the mending into actually these huge areas of weaving like you would do on a loom. And so the labor of fixing things became interesting, and thinking about repair wasn't so important as it was thinking about production and how that could build a kind of object, which then led to this installation that I did about a year ago where I made a fabric piece that's the arms and backs of the shirt. There's no mending in there. There's just holes and a couple of stitched areas. And on the wall is a vinyl decal made of a collage of some of the earlier mending pieces with the muslin, so that were a little bit more skin-like. And it became this kind of architectural landscape and this kind of skin of its own with this garment over it. And I called it Sometimes Things Don't Fit. And I have this really strong desire to do some more vinyl and put smaller pieces on it, but we'll see if that ever happens or not. And that's where I'm going to end. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mark. Our second speaker tonight is Rema Ghuloum. Rema Ghuloum is a visual artist based in Los Angeles, California. She has exhibited nationally and internationally and has been the recipient of multiple grants, including the Pollock Krasner Foundation Grant, the Joan Mitchell Foundation Grant, and her work has been reviewed in Art Forum, Hyperallergenic, the Contemporary Art Review of Los Angeles, and the LA Times, among others. Please welcome Rema Ghuloum.
Thank you guys for having me. Thank you, Liz, for inviting me. I'm going to start. Do I just push play? Okay. Okay. I'm going to start with this quote. It seems to me I write what I see and I paint what I am, by Attila Adnan, who recently passed away. But this really resonates because I think, for me, painting describes things pretty viscerally. Which words cannot. So I've chosen to kind of share pieces that I've made over the years that I think were really kind of important in my development. This is called Pile of Time, 57 Recollections of My Everyday Experience. I made this piece while I was in graduate school. I started school 2 weeks after my sister passed away. So I started this walking meditation where I made 2 paintings a day based on things that I experienced on my walks. And over the course of 2 years, I kind of made these paintings and then arranged them and rearranged them, and they became a visual language for subsequent works. But I think this is an important painting because it kind of shows transcendence and which is sort of a theme that carries on through my work. This is actually a photo from my MFA thesis show. I think it's a good transition point. It's called Light at 15th and Harrison at 3 p.m. And I chose this because it's a small painting. It's 13 by 16 inches. But it was a painting that I reworked multiple times. It was scraped away, but then the image kind of happened really quickly in one shot. But I like that contrast between sort of the history of the painting and that's sort of exposed through the surface and sort of light on top of it. So I'm fast forwarding, that was 2010. This is 2018. This is an installation shot of two paintings from my solo show at Et al. In San Francisco. It was called The Sun Appeared White and Without Its Rays. And it was actually a group of 12 small paintings, all small in scale, and they were also made after my second sister passed away. And I only mention this because and use this sort of as a starting point because my work, themes that run kind of throughout my work are profound loss, love, transformation, temporality, memory, and beauty. And so both of these losses sort of kind of brought me to where I am today. So this is a painting that I made at the Joan Mitchell Center in New Orleans. And a lot of the paintings that were in that exhibition, this is called Premonition. It's 13 by 17 inches. In that exhibition were started at the Joan Mitchell Center, but I didn't complete them until after I got back. But this one was really interesting because this was the only one that I actually did complete. While I was there, we were evacuated because there was a hurricane. And so we had to go, which is why it's called Premonition, but we were evacuated, and I ended up staying at the Marriott in the French Quarter. But I thought this was an important painting in that it kind of sort of completed things within the exhibition. This painting is called Night. It's 13 by 17 inches. So this group of paintings were also kind of marking a moment. I started them at the residency, completed them when I got back after my sister passed away. And they came out of this place of deep sadness, but in my work I want to transcend that and express a range of sensations, emotions, and interconnectedness. So I think the paintings have this potential, and I view them kind of like portals. And this is this is the last painting from that show that I'll share, but it's called I Wish the Sun Rose for You. The paintings in this exhibition were indexical and chronicling time, and my process leads me through and to each painting. So I want to show you sort of, this was at the Joan Mitchell Center, just so you get a sense of how I start a painting. So these are small in scale. Right now I'm working pretty large, actually, but they all sort of start the same. And so I kind of lay them on the floor on some sort of tarp or drop cloth, oftentimes on blocks, and I pour and use different methods of pouring, like squeeze bottles and various other applications. And then I prop them against the wall and I build them up with really thin layers of paint. So scumbling, which is like dry painting, dry brushing, and glazing, thin layers with medium, and then I sand in between each layer of the painting by hand. So it's a really fast process initially, and then it becomes very slow. So oftentimes it can take up to a year to make a painting, even a couple years in some cases. So this is my solo show that I mounted shortly after that exhibition in 2019. It was called Love is a Feeling. And it was comprised of 9 paintings, 7 of which were large in scale, 72 by 54 inches, and 52 by 66 inches. So in this show, I was thinking about expansion, This is at Edward Chell in Los Angeles. I was thinking about expansion, space, breath, love, kind of boundless love. And when I make a painting, I often think about contrast within a painting. So rather than thinking about an idea, I think about what kind of contrast could kind of create a tension. So for example, dimensionality, fluidity, light, shadow, deep, shallow, familiar, unfamiliar, internal, external, visible, invisible. When these kind of contrasts exist in a painting, there's sort of a tension or an opposition that I need to resolve, and that's kind of the challenge. Like I mentioned before, the paintings emerge through the process of building up with thin layers and then excavating, sanding them down, so that kind of creates this residual effect. And then the memory is sort of kind of integral to the surface. So is the color and the paint. So I'm fast forwarding a little bit. I made a lot of work in between that time and this painting. This is called Inner Vision, and this was made in 2019, just before I had my son. And I'm sharing this painting because I feel like it was really important in terms of how it got executed and what is exposed in the painting. So the process is really exposed. You can see it on the bottom and on the edges where the pour creates this kind of oscillating tension between the built-up slower layers and the initial pouring layers or poured layers. And then I'm fast forwarding again to April 2020. So I began a series of drawings called Ether, and these drawings were all small in scale, and they were made while we were sheltering in place, or they started them during the pandemic. And at that time, I had a 5-month-old and was, trying to figure out how I was going to get to my studio, let alone just get through all of that, like most of us were. And so I made these drawings while he slept in his crib at night. And so they're built up. They're two-sided drawings. The back side is oftentimes the date and some information about the day. But I was thinking about ether because it kind of represents energy that occupies everything, the feeling of uncertainty, anxiety, desire for light, beauty, touch. That's kind of what I kind of imagine these to be. They evolved sort of as a diaristic drawing project that I felt I was sort of channeling the collective energy of the moment, and they became a form of daily meditation. And so like my paintings, I would make them, I would build them up, in this case with acrylic wash, and I would sand them, and I would make them in one shot, maybe 2 hours at the most. And the difference was I had to figure out how to kind of create the same type of color and surface and energy that I would in a painting, but more immediately. So I started utilizing optical mixing. So a lot of brush strokes, so your eye would kind of blend the colors together, sort of like a pointillistic style approach to painting. This is another one. And this was the last one that I made on April 7th of 2021. And this actually culminated into a book that will be published in September. So this is an installation shot of my show in 2020 called After Night. And it was comprised of 5 paintings that were all made during the pandemic. And this was at 5 Car Garage. This is a painting called Light Body, 2020 Vision. And this was a painting that I actually started before sheltering in place. I feel like there's a psychic shift that happens after you have a baby. Not only an identity crisis, but it's like exhilarating and exhausting. And I feel like this painting sort of there's a reflection of that. I also became a night painter, which was something I never did before. So I would put my baby to sleep, and then I'd go to my studio at like 8:30 or 9 o'clock, and I would work until midnight. So I think the prismatic color, they all became very spectral, and so I think that has a lot to do with it too. But there is this center. This is a painting called C. And there's a center in these paintings that's kind of destabilizing as well. And so they're full of movement, and they kind of almost fall apart and break down, which was something that was related to that painting Intervision that I showed you earlier. And this painting I finished the day before we had the stay-at-home order in LA, which was kind of premonitory. This is a painting called Sundown from that exhibition. And this is After Night. So this was the show's namesake, and this was actually an important painting. It's important to what I'm doing now. It relates really specifically in that there's like a physical transformation, a color or temperature transformation that happens within the painting from either side, which is something that I'm playing with now a lot in the work. And this is a painting called Twin Flame, and it was the only vertical painting in the exhibition. And I also think this is also an important painting in that, like, the drawing is sort of in the foreground of the painting, which is something that is more apparent now. When I say drawing, it's the pouring. I pour with squeeze bottles, and so the linear element within the painting is something that I'm really working with in my paintings currently. And then I'm just going to show you a couple paintings in between what I'm doing now. This was Stargazer. And I'm thinking a lot about weaving color, like weaving light. So they're built up with these really thin layers of kind of modulated color. It's very prismatic, and kind of really thinking about weaving them within the canvas. This is another one. So this is a painting called The Night We Met, and this was the largest painting that I had painted to this point. It's 72 by 102 inches. I feel very comfortable painting really large. I wish I had painted this large sooner, but it wasn't very practical. But what I like about painting this at this scale is it allowed me to kind of expand outward and explore space in a different way. This is a detail, so you can kind of get a sense of the layering and how built up it is in parts, but then it sort of breaks apart. It's really hard to photograph, but the paint is really integral to the surface, so it really feels like it's part of the canvas in a way. They're very physical. This is a painting called Silence, which is very related to The Night We Met. This is a medium-sized painting. It's 34 by 54 inches, and medium has always been a really challenging, or historically it has been a challenging size for me, but now I feel like I've been able to kind of explore these different kinds of spaces working with it. But I was really thinking about the sound of silence, not just literally, but also kind of being silenced, the inability and also the beauty in all of that at once. Sorry, I ended up moving too quickly. This is a painting called Sister. Thinking also about expansion and color, and spatially what I was trying to do and what I'm trying to do now is kind of create these different structures within the painting. So they're kind of divided and operating in these two different spatial ways. This is another one. So there's discordance, but it's like unified within a kind of close palette. This is called Mirror. Thinking of light and shadow. So this is a detail, so you can get a sense of the surface. It's kind of really scraped away in areas. And then I also started this group of small paintings. This is called Memory, and it's 11 by 11 or 12 and a half inches. And so there was a group of paintings that I actually started before my sister passed away, but I wasn't able to complete them. And so I've been completing them, and this has sort of been so 3 years later, almost 4 years later, really kind of revitalizing them in a way, and it's kind of brought sort of closure, but also has created sort of this contrast within the space and the surface and the light that's physical. And it's been sort of an ongoing practice that I've been doing in addition to my larger paintings. And this is a painting called Last Light. So I have an exhibition up through the end of next week, the 30th, at Contemporary Art Matters. And the show is called Last Light, which is the namesake of the painting. This is 72 by 102 inches. And you can kind of see how my drawings, those ether drawings, have really influenced my paintings. So I don't really think of them as studies in any way, but just the act of making them has really I've absorbed that and introduced them into the painting. This is another painting called Total Eclipse that's in that exhibition as well. And in this painting, I really wanted to push sort of the contrast within the pour, but also activate it in the center. So leaving a lot more exposed. And then this painting also is in that exhibition. It's called When Everything Was a Rainbow. And I'm going to show you a detail because it's really hard to photograph, but it was built up over a year with really, really thin marks that are sanded down. So that's very prismatic up close, but it looks sort of more cool from a distance. This is another painting called A Day. This is titled after an Emily Dickinson poem that's about the sun rising and setting and life and death. This painting actually took a year on and off to finish. It's not big, it's 34 by 54 inches, but it was, if you can kind of get a sense of the surface, it's kind of really built up with these really thin layers. And the edges in my paintings are really important because it is the history of the process that I actually kind of build up on the edges. So whatever's on my palette at the end of a session, I put it on the edge of the painting. So it's like a physical history of that day. That's another detail. And this painting is called Communion. And it's sort of, I wanted it to kind of be full spectrum, using all the colors, but also kind of divide it spatially again, kind of trying to create that kind of discordance where you kind of enter into it from different points of view. This is a detail. So it's very physical, but also very thin, and the color is sort of drawn in. And this is a painting I'm showing next month in an exhibition, but I thought I just finished a whole group of paintings that I haven't exhibited yet, but this is one of them. It's called Waking Dream, and I'll show you a detail. So really building off of that last group of paintings, really thinking about kind of transitions within a painting, kind of these drawn elements and these kind of discordant shifts within a painting as well. And then lastly, I'm going to show you one drawing. So I started a whole new drawing series called Sun. I moved into a new place with my son, who's 2.5, and not by choice, but I was up before sunrise with him. And we wanted an activity, so we would draw, and I was just so compelled by his sort of ability to be so kind of economical. And there was like I wanted to kind of see through his eyes. And so I started working on cardstock and construction paper and making these paintings. I didn't make this with him. I would just sit with him and I would draw, but I would make these in the evening when he would go to sleep. So I started this whole new series called Sun, S-U-N, that are all small in scale too. They're like 12 by 12 inches or a little bit smaller. That's all. I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rema. So now we'll have our Q&A session with Rema and Mark. If you have a question, raise your hand, and our wonderful painting, drawing, and printmaking intern, Silma, will hand you the mic.
Hi, this is a question for Mark. I was just thinking about mending and how it's this maintenance-focused labor. And so I was wondering how you think about labor in your work.
All right, I'm green now. So on one hand, I think about labor in terms of the fact that I'm very privileged to be able to do the kind of work that I do, because it's completely impractical and I'm making art, it's not about a function or a need. On the other hand, the actual work of being in the studio and doing the work, there's something about the processes of mending, process of knitting, all of those that allow me to get into a space with the work that changes the way I think. And so the labor allows me to see the work in a different way that I don't necessarily conceive of when I set out to do the piece. And so that's important. And then, especially with the mending work, I'm thinking about labor in terms of the fact that it goes back to a historic tradition of those young women learning to do that for vastly different reasons, and that we don't take care of our things that way anymore. And so it's kind of odd that something in my studio has moved to my personal life, where I sort of said it, and I don't know how many people caught it. I knit my own socks, and because I've knit them, I mend them because I spent time knitting them. So labor becomes very precious in an absurd but personal way for me. So it's a lot of those different things. Thanks for the question. Good one.
Hi, this question is... Oh, hello. This question is for Rema. Is Rema? I am curious about if you could talk about how your process leads to the final, like a part of the content of the final piece. Like your work has to do a lot with mood and with self-awareness and emotion, and I wonder how much process leads into that.
Process has actually a lot to do with the end result. Like the only thing that I really sort of determine early on is maybe the palette, but because the pattern sort of just emerges, I'm responding. So because I'm sanding down after each layer, there are certain things that get preserved, and there are others. I sand the entire painting down. So even if I like something, I still sand it down. Partially because I'm really interested in the surface. I want it to have this kind of very felt or visceral effect. So it's sort of a pattern. I think a lot about it sort of geologically, sort of like the way a crystal might be formed. It's sort of the pattern really emerges, and I allow it to sort of do that. And I know when it's finished, It's a feeling. But I can't really predict what it's going to look like. I don't make preliminary sketches. I avoid that very intentionally. In the past, I used to make sculptures that I would then paint observationally, and then I would paint from memory. And so I had these strategies, and I was more interested in how I would get to the same place or think about the same ideas without having all of those resources. And so I'm always surprised how it ends up being not even what I expected it to be, but to kind of evoke this feeling that I didn't intend, but kind of felt right at the moment, if that makes sense.
Is it on? Okay. My question's for Rema, and I was wondering if you ever make any collaboration work with your kid.
I haven't, but I probably will at some point. all of his drawings are so good, I don't want to collaborate. I just, they're just good as they are. But yeah, no, a lot of people ask me that, and we're just, I'm a single mom, so I'm always with him if I'm not painting, so I can predict that we likely will.
Hi, thank you to both of you for sharing and speaking. It was so lovely. I have a question for Mark. I know you talked about gender in your presentation and weaving and mending and knitting often being women's work. And I was just wondering, I have two friends, for example, who were both taught to knit by their mothers. And I was wondering how you found yourself even in the world of knitting and fibers.
So when I was my mom's mom, my grandmother was a school teacher and a farm person. And when my brother and I would visit in the summers, she would teach me anything I wanted to learn. So she helped me make a cowboy vest when I was about 5 that was fake fur, cow spots. It was great. And one year I wanted to learn to knit, so I made the most impractical pot holders for my mom out of acrylic yarn because they're plastic, so they'll melt. And they were red heart yarn, of course. And she didn't teach me how to start or end. So at some point in my 30s, I wanted to relearn to knit to teach to my students to make it a sculptural process for a dimensional fiber class. And I realized I knew how to knit, but I didn't know how to start or end. So I asked my wife, who's a knitter, and she said, well, this is how you do it, but here's the Knitting for Dummies book, and leave me alone trying to knit. So a little of all of that.
I guess this question is for both of you. How do you know when something's done? How do you know, is there a matrix for that? I can see you being very protecting moments in each of your work and not wanting to embellish too much, or it could go on forever, so there's this point. Thank you.
Do you want me to answer? I've actually, the last few years, I've tried to stop sooner than I might have previously. So oftentimes it's maybe a kind of, not even a feeling, but a kind of quality in the surface. I know I just kind of answered that, but there's a quality in the surface that contrasts maybe something that's more exposed. But it's a feeling. I mean, I'm not really interested in making work forever either. I like moving forward, but I do think that, in some cases, I started work in 2018, hadn't touched them until recently, and then revisited them, and that felt really cathartic and important in terms of kind of time traveling and kind of creating an object that holds that energy. So I think it depends, but depending on what it is that I'm making, but I do think that ultimately it's a feeling.
Yeah, so the costumes, the bed covers, the trading cards, they were all finished because the costume was done, it had the arms and the legs and that kind of stuff. So that was pretty easy. When I switched to the mending work, I kind of turned my whole way of working upside down, intentionally and unintentionally, and so a lot like Rema just said, there's a kind of feeling I have about when those pieces are done. They start at a certain point with a cut in the fabric, and then I feel like I'm responding through time to how stitches accumulate and how the fabric changes, and there's always some moment of kind of awkward weirdness about a piece that says, okay, this is what I want, which it's not a matrix in any way, it's like a gut feeling. And sometimes that means I'm cutting a lot of stitches out and putting them back in, or sometimes I'm covering over a lot of stitches. And like I said, I turned things upside down. The costumes would sort of happen shoulders to feet, put the head on and the arms, and it was done. These sit on the wall for weeks at a time sometimes, and sometimes they just sort of happen. and so I just have to trust a gut.
How many are you working on at a time? Are you working on a lot of paintings or a lot of, both of them, or a lot of pieces of fabric when you're making your stitches on there? Are you working on a lot at the same time, or are you working on one at the same time?
I usually have a couple to 3 things going on in the studio at once now, but before it was one at a time.
I definitely don't work one at a time. I work on multiple paintings at a time. So I think I had shown a picture at the residency with those smaller works. So maybe it ended up being like 20 paintings that I started kind of at the same time, pouring, creating different palettes for them, and then with large-scale paintings, I make as many as I can fit in my studio. My process, I can't really do the pouring and the other part of the process, which is the sanding and the glazing and scumbling at the same time. So I get as messy as possible. So right now I just finished a group of like 10 paintings, 4 really large ones, like 72 by 102. So I poured all of them initially, and so then they're just stacked and ready to go. And then I work on all of those kind of simultaneously because I paint with oil. They need to dry also. So, and then they kind of relate to one another too in a really, not in a non-linear way, but also there's a specificity or sort of a language that's carried through all of them.
Thank you. I really like the way, Mark, you were talking about clothing and the body and the idea of mending. I'm curious why because you work with the knitted superhero costumes, they really have a lot to do about the body, but then when you're talking about the mending work, you remove the body a little bit by presenting the work flat. I'm just curious about your decision you're almost like mending for, we usually mend so we can wear the thing again, but you're removing that, so could you talk about that, please?
Yeah, that's a really good question. With this, these started much more pictorially and 2-dimensional with the muslin pieces, and there was actually a body of work that happened before the mending pieces that I don't show anybody because I don't want to see it again, which were initial tests with the embroidery before the mending that looked at parts of skin and sort of recreated it with stitching. So I had set out to make 2-dimensional pieces largely because I just wanted to be able to explore pictorially, and that led to all these decisions about, when I realized that I didn't have to make pictures of the skin and the scars, I could actually make scars in the fabric, that's when the mending came in. And so I didn't, until recently, go back to thinking about dimensionality with those pieces. There's a bunch of things that I've been making for the last few months that are moving away from garments, but using old army blankets, and have increased the scale of the mends to use like the acrylic yarn as the mending instead of embroidery floss. And they're so puckered and so dimensional that they're like 2.5D relief, and they become sort of like topographical, like literal topographical maps, like models or something. So I'm going back to dimensional in some ways, but yeah, I think things just got really symbolic for a while instead of physically, sculpturally real. That was part of the change. I think there's 2 people over there too.
Mark, I have a question about the mending. When I think of mending as being something for when something gets worn out or there's an accident, and it's like something you have to do to kind of get the piece going again. I'm curious about your decision to actually like cut the fabric and then go about the mending. It seems like sort of subversive, but or in a way. But
that would be cool. Good, I'm glad. The decision really came from knowing that history of the mending samplers, and that they cut those square holes and then did their their magical weaving. It's just so precise to think kids did that. So I sort of made the leap from knowing that history and then researching more of that history. And also, one of my mentors in graduate school is an artist named Ann Wilson who collects old, worn, stained linens and sews hair on to bind the holes off. She doesn't repair them. And I don't know that it was directly in my head, but I definitely didn't want to copy my mentor. So while we both appreciate making holes in fabric, there's a little boundary there.
It reminds me of the wabi-sabi technique with the gold filling in the cracks. It's really pretty.
I had just a quick follow-up question from before. In talking about your work, you said you started 20 pieces at once, and just curious if starting 20, do you end up with 20? And maybe you can both talk a little bit about, kind of your process and what you do about the failures, or are there failures, or do they all get to turn into successes?
Go for it.
They don't all turn into successes, but I feel like most of the large ones do. Maybe because when I start the small ones, I have more freedom because they're a smaller scale. But if I overwork, so what I do now actually is, rather than throwing them away, if I can't resolve them early on, because the surface quality is so important and I don't want to overwork it, and you can't over sand, otherwise the surface changes, I just put it aside. And then I'll come back to it when I feel like I understand, after I actually make some other paintings, so I understand something new through that process, and then I can come back and return to them. But yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I have a lot of failed paintings, but now I try to be more just cognizant of what I'm doing. So it's not just like, I do have, not ideas, but I want to be more conscientious of the moves I make, I guess.
Yeah, they don't all succeed, despite how many threads I cut out and how many things I sew over. There are some things that I've made too many wrong decisions at a certain point. Basically it's like, oh, I'm going to start this. It'll come from this idea. Okay, that's fine. And then I put it on this thing and don't think about how it fits on there or some other thing like that. Or they just get overworked and I can't look at it anymore. So just like Rema said, some things sit on the wall for a long time and then I can go back to them. The army blanket stuff, actually, I tried to use the army blanket 5 years ago and I did some really dumb stuff. But 3/4 of the army blanket wasn't touched, so I cut it up and started working on it, and now there's things. So it just takes time sometimes.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I just wanted to remind everyone that tomorrow morning there will be orientation here in Shermer at 8:45. I hope you enjoy your time here. Thank you.
Thanks.